Okay, let's unpack this. We're diving into what I think is a really deep structural mystery.
It really is.
I mean, why do systems that look so robust, so stable, and incredibly active,
Right. They look great on the surface.
be they economic networks, ecosystems, or social organizations, why do they suddenly just collapse?
Mm,
Usually, when we analyze something like complexity, we approach it quantitatively.
mm.
We're counting components, measuring the sheer scale, maybe calculating unpredictability.
And the sources you shared argue that those quantitative metrics, the ones that focus on size and randomness, are fundamentally looking in the wrong place.
So this is a different approach entirely.
This deep dive really moves complexity from being a technical puzzle to an existential inquiry. The focus shifts completely.
From what?
From what systems do their behavior to whether their underlying structure is actually justified.
Justified. That's a strong word for structural analysis. I mean, what justifies a structure?
The central question becomes, does this system, as it evolves, move toward what's called meaningful coherence? Is the accumulation of all these parts and interactions actually reinforcing something durable, something that sustains the identity of those parts?
Or is it just accumulating noise?
Yeah.
Entanglement under the mask of growth?
Precisely. That's the core question.
So our mission today is ambitious.
Mm.
We really need to dissect the structural logic behind this idea of existential integrity.
We're basically establishing a logic of evolving systems based on this idea of coherence.
And tracing how genuine complexity arises not by, eliminating internal tension or contradiction, but by correctly integrating it.
We're shifting the focus dramatically from mere behavior to the internal architecture.
So let's start there.
The core of this analysis starts with a radical redefinition
Of complexity itself.
of complexity itself. It's not a function of quantity, the number of elements, the scale of interaction.
It's not about how much stuff is going on.
No, it's about relational meaningfulness.
Which is a qualitative criterion. It's judging the intrinsic value of the connections being formed. So if I'm looking at a massive data network, it's not the terabytes of information flowing through it.
No.
It's the quality of the relationship between the nodes that actually matters. It's integration, not just accumulation.
That's the difference between an elaborate, tangled mess and a finely tuned instrument. The sources talk about the emergence threshold.
Okay, what's that?
Complexity, they argue, only really begins when interactions among differentiated parts generate irreducible properties.
Meaning they create something entirely new that you can't just reduce back down to the isolated functions of the parts.
Exactly. That irreducible leap, which is formed through integration, not accumulation, that's the relational threshold.
And this threshold has to separate the meaningful from the noise. How do
Yeah.
we draw that line qualitatively?
Meaningful complexity is characterized by interactions that enhance two things at the same time.
Okay.
First, the system's overall stability and unity. And second, and this is so crucial, the integrity and distinct identity of its constituent parts.
So it's a logic of mutual enhancement.
It has to be.
And if that dual enhancement isn't happening, that's what you're calling noise.
Right. Noise is when interactions produce only unpredictable behavior or just excessive entanglement without any directional purpose. The system just drifts toward what the essay calls hollow accumulation.
It looks complex, but it's structurally exhausted.
Mm-hmm.
This brings us to the core philosophical condition for meaningful complexity, the criterion of reciprocity. This is essential, but it sounds incredibly abstract.
Let's ground it immediately then. Reciprocity just means that meaningful complexity sustains the system's stability while allowing the parts to retain and deepen their own distinct identities.
Okay, so it's a two-way street.
The key is balanced recursion. The part must sustain the value of the whole, but at the same time, the whole must recursively acknowledge and sustain the value of the part.
Can you give us a sharp contrast, maybe in a social or business context, of where this reciprocity fails?
Oh, a classic example of failed reciprocity is a company or organization where the individual contributor, the part, is solely driven to sustain shareholder value or, organizational metrics, the whole.
Right.
But the whole fails to recursively sustain the value, the distinct identity, and the well-being of that individual.
And that leads to burnout, internal fragmentation.
And collapse, even while the quarterly numbers might look good. The complexity is purely quantitative. It lacks that existential justification.
So we're not starting with how fast the system runs or how many nodes it has.
No.
We're starting with a philosophical judgment. Does this configuration, whatever it is, achieve genuine structural reciprocity? Is the value of the individual retained and even strengthened as the collective grows?
That foundational distinction between complexity as mere relational density and complexity as directional integration, that is the starting point for everything else.
So this inherent requirement for reciprocity, it forces us into what the sources call the dual nature of complexity. And they insist this is a distinction of kind, not merely of degree.
It is. It's fundamental.
It's not just about how much interaction there is, but the direction that the interaction takes.
Exactly. You can have a dense network. It can be active with transactions and interdependencies, yet the underlying complexity can be structurally corrosive.
Just an accumulation of noise.
Not a recursion of purpose.
Okay, so let's look at the robust side. Meaningful complexity.
Meaningful complexity is resilient because it recursively aligns internal differentiation with structural integration.
So the individual parts maintain their unique forms and functions.
And that very uniqueness deepens the unity of the whole system. It stabilizes the internal tension, strengthens interdependence, and increases the overall systemic depth.
It actually transforms contradiction from a problem to be solved into a resource.
A resource for further recursion, yes.
That's deeply counterintuitive. If contradiction is the driver, what happens in meaningfulness complexity?
It disrupts this necessary alignment. Meaningless complexity, it just blurs distinctions. It weakens the very unity it appears to be building.
So it multiplies instability, even while it looks like it's growing.
Right. The source material is adamant about this. This kind of complexity multiplies contradiction without resolving it. It results in systems that just collapse into disintegration under the burden of their own entanglement.
They lack true structural resolve.
Precisely.
So the appearance of structural growth, say a government agency adding layers of bureaucracy or a company acquiring dozens of subsidiaries, that isn't necessarily meaningful complexity.
Not unless it serves a clear direction.
Well, why is directionality so essential here?
Because complexity must serve relational meaningfulness and therefore coherence. Without a clear directionality, a vector toward that balanced recursion we talked about, complexity just degenerates into an unstable appearance.
It becomes a dense web of interactions wearing the mask of structure.
But it lacks the underlying existential justification of integrating those relationships coherently.
So systems need a kind of structural compass, one that insists that growth must not erase the value of the components. And without that compass, complexity is just chaos that hasn't failed yet.
Precisely. If that directional vector is missing, the system loses its ability to distinguish essential connections from parasitic ones, and that leads to inevitable collapse.
Okay, so if we accept that complexity must be directional, we need an engine to drive that directionality.
And the sources identify this engine as tension.
Tension.
Tension is not an anomaly in complex systems. It is their generative force.
That's the part that is really hard to swallow. We spend our lives trying to reduce friction, conflict, tension.
Of course.
Yet here we're saying complexity arises specifically because this system recursively integrates that tension.
The integration is the key. Meaningful configuration arises from these inherent opposing tendencies. Think unity versus multiplicity or stability versus change.
Things that can't be resolved by just reducing them.
You can't resolve them by reduction. You can't simplify a living organism without killing it. Complexity deepens only when a system successfully holds these contradictions in structural tension. If you suppress the contradiction, you get temporary simplicity, but you guarantee that you'll prevent any enduring coherence.
Okay, wait, I need a concrete challenge here. If I run a supply chain, tension means delays, bottlenecks, defects.
Sure.
How can I possibly view a supply chain delay or conflict within a team as a resource for deeper recursion, rather than just a cost to be eliminated?
That's the pivot. If you eliminate the tension immediately, you might solve the local problem, but you lose the information. You lose the structural challenge that the tension provided.
Okay.
If your supply chain delay is integrated, meaning you analyze a contradiction between delivery speed and quality control, and then build a new, flexible structural layer that handles both simultaneously, you have used the tension as a resource.
And if you just pressure the workers to move faster?
You've suppressed the tension, and you're setting yourself up for a future, more catastrophic structural failure.
So is recursive tension just a highbrow term for disorder?
Absolutely not. Recursive tension is defined as patterned instability.
Patterned instability.
It's an engine that has to be absorbed into deeper recursions. If contradiction is externalized or denied, systems just fragment. But if it's acknowledged and distributed across scales used to inform structural change, complexity becomes genuinely self-organizing.
So the ability to carry contradiction without disintegrating is the threshold of meaningful growth.
That's the threshold.
If tension is the engine, what prevents that engine from overheating and exploding the system? We need some kind of stabilizing architecture.
Which the sources call harmony.
Harmony.
Harmony is the essential frame. Without it, tension loses its orientation and just dissolves into noise and chaos.
So it's not a static resolution.
No, it is the coherent framework that holds the parts in a balanced interdependence. It's the structural context that validates the tension.
Therefore, the architecture of coherence requires both elements.
Yes, it requires recursive contradiction, which generates the structural depth, and it requires structural integration or harmony, which maintains the continuity.
And that's the condition where contradiction is resolved at higher orders without erasing the original distinctions that generated it.
The system advances through recursive transcendence. It finds a higher mode of being rather than just linear, blind accumulation.
Let's delve deeper into that core mechanism itself, recursive integration. How does this mechanism successfully absorb tension while maintaining both the part and the whole?
The capacity for any meaningful growth lies in this recursive integration. The primary structural rule is the preservation of balance.
Okay.
The system has to preserve the distinctness of the part while at the same time reinforcing the unity of the whole.
And the warning about imbalance is severe. It leads to structural collapse no matter which pole dominates.
Correct. If the pole of the part dominates, the system fragments into isolated simplicity.
Like a company where every department operates completely autonomously, ignoring the corporate mission.
Exactly. And if the pole of the whole dominates, it collapses into a totalizing structure.
An authoritarian state where individual functions are just eradicated for the sake of a forced unity.
And true complexity only arises when that contradiction is integrated in a way that neither flattens nor erases its opposing poles.
This integration sounds incredibly dynamic, not like a fixed state you achieve.
It is entirely dynamic. Each successful cycle of integration resolves a tension, but that very resolution creates new tensions that demand deeper recursion.
So entities adapt not by dissolving their nature, but by finding higher modes of participation.
And simultaneously, the collective has to evolve frameworks that preserve the identity of those parts while incorporating them as coherent differences.
It's a dual demand.
That dual demand makes recursive integration the central, ongoing mechanism of complexity.
And as the system matures, the nature of the tension it has to deal with changes. This is the maturity of integration.
Yes, early cycles resolve the visible, surface oppositions, the easy fixes.
Right.
Later cycles, which define mature integration, have to absorb abstract or latent tensions, often hidden deep within the system's foundation.
So maturity isn't about simplifying these profound contradictions.
No, it's defined by redistributing them across scales. This allows higher recursions to stabilize what lower-order configurations just couldn't handle.
Okay, so we've talked a lot about complexification. Now we have to address its necessary opposite, simplicity.
And the sources argue it is not the negation of complexity, but its essential internal regulator.
That's fascinating. I always assumed complexity and simplicity were a zero-sum game. You get more of one, you get less of the other.
Ugh.
Why does complexity need simplicity?
Well, exactly. In living systems, simplification is an internal necessity. It's an active process. The individual entity has to reduce its own entropy not to fight the network, but to preserve its internal clarity and directionality.
So it can remain a coherent, useful participant.
Precisely.
And if this internal simplification is absent, or if it's the wrong kind of simplification.
Without true simplification, participation in the collective recursion becomes chaotic or redundant.
Okay.
And meaningless simplification is either absent entirely, like in purely acausal systems where coherence can't form, or it is, as the source says, unjust. It's a force of erasure that ignores the complexity it was meant to regulate.
So true simplification is a structural response to excess. It selects, it filters, it distills.
Without severing identity. That's the key part.
This hidden order of simplification sounds like a structural requirement for intelligibility. It provides stable access points.
It is the internal map. True complexity must contain this hidden order. It needs stable internal frames of clarity access points for comprehension and transformation without distorting the overall system.
So complexity without simplification loses meaning.
And simplicity without evolution loses relevance.
The analogy the sources provide here is perfect for getting our heads around this balance. Fractal structures.
Fractals make this principle visible. Their recursive self-similarity demonstrates how finite, simple rules can yield infinite differentiation without violating the initial simplicity.
Right. At every scale, the fractal balances complexity and order.
And that allows coherence to emerge without erasing distinction.
The sources refer to this as the natural geometry of meaningful recursion.
It embodies a kind of structural ethic that fulfills that criterion of reciprocity we talked about earlier. The whole is visible in every part, and crucially, no part is sacrificed to represent the whole.
That's a powerful idea.
This patterning demonstrates that the deepest complexity is the kind that continually remembers its simplicity. That ensures intelligibility throughout the system's structure and allows the part to orient itself within the whole.
Okay, so now we have to anchor this theory in physical reality. Let's start with non-living systems.
Right, anything from atoms to geology or even computational architectures. Here, complexity is achieved through structural evolution governed by fixed objective laws.
Physical constraints, thermodynamic gradients, that kind of thing.
Exactly. And the entities in these systems are essentially passive participants in this evolution.
They're passive.
Yes. Their complexity arises from externally imposed adjustments, like self-organization or phase transitions that are driven by external gradients.
So they can achieve highly patterned forms, modularity, or resilience.
But those patterns are determined entirely by external constraints and boundary conditions.
And this is that crucial non-recursive limit we mentioned earlier. If a non-living system encounters contradiction or tension, how does it process it?
Well, the contradictions are redistributed or neutralized structurally, but they're never resolved from within.
Because they lack what's called recursive subjectivity?
They lack that, they react without judgment, and they adjust without any internal directionality or agency. They can hold tension temporarily in a structured way, but they can't internalize it and integrate it into a deeper self-generated recursion.
So their complexity is pattern determination, not participatory recursion.
Correct. It can manifest an externally imposed coherence, resilience, structural efficiency, but it lacks any inward meaning. The coherence is imposed by objective physical laws, not emerging from self-recursive integration.
And even advanced AI systems would fall into this category, according to this logic.
According to this structural logic, yes. AI reflects structural efficiency, like entropy dispersal and boundary optimization. It doesn't reflect subjective meaning-making.
So any structural change, like compression or refinement.
It's external. It holds no inward identity or agency. It is simply reconfiguration under environmental imbalance or human programming.
The sources describe this as the acausal bedrock. That sounds like serious jargon. Why is this passive structural complexity foundational to everything else?
That phrase, a causal bedrock, it just means the foundation of physical reality that's governed by cause and effect, where the rules are fixed.
Okay.
Non-living complexity establishes the objective architecture of constraint-bound interaction that makes all subsequent evolution possible.
The third-dimensional substrate.
Right. That structural regularity is the precondition for coherence, but it isn't meaningful until it's integrated into recursion. Without this structural frame, meaning-making would just collapse into formlessness.
This finally brings us to the unique structural achievement of living systems. They don't just accumulate structural complexity.
They inwardly generate meaning through what the sources call spiritual intelligence.
Spiritual intelligence.
This capacity, spiritual intelligence, is defined as the recursive ability to refine one's identity through contradiction. It operates through recursive causality.
Meaning that every successful integration of tension deepens the system's capacity for future growth and self-definition.
Yes.
So, if a non-living system breaks and reforms structurally, a living system internalizes that breaking and reforms itself with an internal memory. That sounds like the essence of growth.
That's a perfect way to put it. Think of it like a scar tissue analogy. A physical system breaks and mends structurally according to physical law.
Okay.
A living system internalizes the breaking, the contradiction, and reforms itself with an internal memory and consciousness, which is the scar tissue. It makes it wiser and structurally stronger than before, not just optimized.
And this is where we introduce the dual existence of life, the objective substrate and the subjective spirit.
Life carries both. It has the objective third-dimensional substrate natural law, which it inherits from non-living systems, and it has the first-dimensional subjective spirit, or inner agency, which is governed by spiritual law.
And it's this inner agency, the capacity for choice and reflection, that allows life to select and reorganize its structure from within.
And so, Contradiction is internalized. It becomes a creative force.
Not just externally distributed.
No, it's internalized, becoming a force that simultaneously reorganizes the system and the identity of the parts. This recursive act yields a structure capable of deeper integration.
And generates individuality, directionality, and crucially, memory.
And memory is not just passive storage here.
Nope.
Memory is defined as earned coherence. It's structure that's been reinscribed with significance through recursive retention. This aligns complexity specifically with identity and the capacity for future transformation.
Which is what distinguishes life from mere reactive growth.
Yes.
So how is this balance, this spiritual intelligence achieved?
It arises through what the sources call correct dualization. This is where subjective agency integrates the structural complexity using the second-dimensional medium of existential generalization.
That's a mouthful.
It's essentially the capacity to form inward, self-aware representations of the whole that are structurally mirrored within the individual spirit.
So existential generalization is the tool that links the inner spirit to the outer structure.
Exactly. Life reconciles agency with structure through this generalization, using spirit rightly. This means resolving contradiction through self-awareness, safeguarding individuation, and generating meaningful complexity through this inner integration.
It's the complex movement of recursive causality through which life becomes meaningfully complex in time.
Yes, exactly.
So, since we established that complexity must serve coherence, let's solidify its rigorous definition.
Okay. Coherence is the persistent preservation of distinguishable internal identities alongside an ever-deepening interdependence that augments system-level function across at least two nested scales.
So it's not just having a lot of structure, it's having secure, multi-layered existential integrity.
Precisely. And this coherence has to be built from within. It has to be achieved recursively.
An internal genesis.
Not imposed externally. Each structural layer must integrate the tensions inherited from the layer below, preparing the ground for the next set of oppositions.
And while coherence is an existential thing, we have to be able to observe it. What are the signs of genuine coherence?
We look for three observable patterns. First, persistent relational structures that bind parts across different scales.
Okay.
Second, modular architectures that preserve the autonomy of each part while still sustaining its functional contribution to the whole.
And the third one is the key test.
It's resilience. When the system is disrupted, coherence is revealed in its ability to reconfigure without forfeiting the integrity of its parts.
This clarifies when emergence, the rise of new stabilized functions, is meaningful versus when it's just noise.
Exactly. Emergence is meaningful only when it preserves the clarity of each part and reinforces the structural balance sustaining the whole.
And if novelty just multiplies without resolving deeper existing tensions, if it's just chaotic innovation,
then it is defined as incoherence. It's change without structural necessity, and it's set up for eventual collapse.
So coherence becomes the ultimate existential criterion.
Absolutely. Systems that fail to stabilize contradiction through coherence, turbulent dynamics, social fragmentation, bloated architectures, they decay. They fail not from excess complexity, but from insufficient coherence.
So coherence is both the measure of meaning and the condition for structural survival.
That's it.
If complexity is constantly holding tension, it can't evolve in a straight line. It has to have a structural rhythm.
And the sources define this rhythm as an oscillation between compression and expansion.
Right.
Meaningful complexity advances through this structural rhythm, inward consolidation, which is compression, and outward diversification, which is expansion.
And these oscillations are the system's way of stabilizing contradiction across changing contexts. Let's define compression. It sounds like refinement, not just reduction.
It is structural refinement. It's an inward consolidation where the system refines its internal composition, filters out the excess, strengthens distinct roles, and stabilizes relational tension. It minimizes noise.
And crucially, it protects coherence.
By tightening complexity into an intelligible form, reinforcing the stability of the whole.
What's the risk of too much compression?
If this tightening becomes rigid, the system loses adaptability and collapses into stagnation. It fails to absorb new external tensions. It just becomes brittle.
And expansion.
Expansion opens up new structural layers. It deepens and diversifies the connective architecture without diluting the coherence. It multiplies the system's ability to integrate tension across scales. It is necessary growth.
But expansion without compression, that's the risk of bloat.
Exactly. Without the grounding that's provided by compression, expansion becomes incoherent. Novelty accumulates faster than the structure can sustain, and that leads to bloat and eventual disintegration.
So oscillation is a sign of meaningful optimization.
It is the only way that balance evolves. It alternates, with each movement correcting the excesses of the other. It prevents the system from collapsing into sameness over compression or dissolving into multiplicity unbounded expansion.
The sources differentiate between the inner principle and the outer rhythm here.
The inner principle is that directional tension between simplification and complexification unity and multiplicity, which coherence has to constantly hold.
In the outer rhythm.
The outer rhythm compression and expansion is the temporal manifestation through which that inner balance is achieved in a lived evolutionary motion.
So they're structurally inseparable.
They are. The outer oscillation is the mechanism through which inner coherence endures.
Okay, so we have to now apply this logic to failure. Collapse is not always an end state.
No, it can serve as a reorganization, but only if the system is structurally alive.
And the key distinction is whether contradiction is erased or if it's structurally transformed.
That's the whole thing.
So let's look at meaningless disintegration first.
This happens when the recursive medium of coherence is lost. Tensions overflow, distinctions fragment, and the architecture loses its continuity.
So what's left is just complexity without recursion.
A shell of interaction without any integrative architecture. This failure is not redemptive. It marks the exhaustion of meaningful structure and the rise of systemic noise. It makes the system unsustainable and unrecoverable.
Meaningful collapse, by contrast, is what initiates a new recursion.
Yes, it retains the contradiction, but it strategically redistributes it into a higher order frame, often through simplification or selective compression.
Like a natural disaster wiping out an old forest structure.
But the seed bank and the soil composition remain reorganized for stronger future growth. The system's identity is reoriented for structural renewal because it didn't erase the fundamental tensions that drive life.
The sources define the essence of meaningful failure by 3 specific conditions that have to remain after the initial structural break.
First, the surviving identities of the parts must endure in a recoverable form. The components still know who they are and what they can do.
Okay.
Second, the tensions that drove the instability must be preserved, open to reintegration. The structural issues aren't swept under the rug, they're retained as information.
And third.
The possibility must remain for these conditions to support a coherence that is greater than before the collapse. If those conditions are met, the failure serves evolution.
And if not, breakage just becomes dispersal.
Right.
This entire framework points toward a system that is, by definition, never complete. Why is meaningful complexity structurally unfinishable?
Because contradiction is inexhaustible.
Ah.
Integrating a contradiction doesn't eliminate it, it merely resolves the current manifestation, and in doing so, it reveals the next layer of tension at a higher order. The evolution of complexity is structurally unfinishable, not because of a flaw, but because the recursion of meaning has no ultimate boundary.
This is the paradox of resolution.
Total coherence would require resolving contradiction once and for all, which would mean either collapsing multiplicity into sameness or freezing evolution to preserve unity.
And both of those actions violate the logic of generative tension.
Complexity remains alive only when that polarity between unity and multiplicity is preserved continuously.
So stability doesn't come from being finished. It comes from what the sources call correct incompletion.
Exactly. A complex system is stable not because it becomes unchanging, but because it evolves through correcting completion. Each cycle increases resilience, yet it never abolishes the tension. Each stabilization deepens function while simultaneously revealing the next layer of contradiction.
So a perfect complex system is like a perfectly aged barrel of wine. If you seal it forever and say it's finished, you've actually killed its potential. Is that the kind of dynamic, active state of incompletion we're talking about?
That's spot on. The refusal of finality is key to its integrity. If complexity were finalized, it would inevitably collapse into rigid unity or dissolve into disorganized multiplicity. The structure of meaning requires the system to remain provisionally coherent, never terminally closed.
This perpetual motion, then, must be guided by a structural compass.
Yes. Complexity evolves meaningfully only when transformations are guided by a directionality that preserves coherence and that arises from a structurally correct orientation.
And in living systems, this directionality stems from correct dualization.
Yes, balancing those first-dimensional impulses, like agency and intention, with second-dimensional coherence or structural self-awareness. That generates a guiding vector that aligns transformation with meaning.
And this ensures that growth doesn't accidentally disrupt the hard-won coherence.
And that expansion doesn't dissolve the very identity it seeks to extend.
And the ultimate goal is structural fidelity.
Correct. Directionality is not a fixed goal. It is structural fidelity, the preservation of that generative tension between unity and multiplicity so that neither pole is privileged.
And systems destabilize if they drift toward sameness.
Where the whole suppresses the part, erasing differentiation.
Or disintegration.
Where the part rejects the whole, asserting separateness without contributing.
And this requires what's called recursive mirroring. How does that work in practice?
This is the mechanism for structural fidelity.
Yeah.
The part must contain an internal representation of the collective, the whole existence it belongs to, and it has to use that representation to guide its interactions.
And likewise, the collective has to carry a differentiated awareness of its parts.
Integrating their evolution without erasure, without this mirroring, this constant feedback loop between the individual and the collective complexity just loops into noise.
And if that mirroring is absent, agency fragments and directionality is lost.
Exactly. And the sources make this vital point. It is directionality that justifies complexity, not the other way around. The correct orientation, informed by coherence, must precede and guide the structure.
Okay, we've covered some intensely abstract philosophical ground. Now we face the final massive challenge: translating these deep qualitative principles into a reproducible quantitative diagnostic.
Measuring coherence.
This is where the rubber meets the road.
This is a bold attempt to operationalize the theory. To measure coherence, we have to capture a node's contribution to the system's structural clarity and its proportional alignment.
And this requires 4 fundamental parameters that analyze the node's function dynamically.
It does.
So let's start with the first one, parameter A, degree of differentiation.
Right. So this measures how well a node maintains a distinct internal identity while participating. It reflects the stability of its role and the uniqueness of its outputs relative to its neighbors.
You're looking for structural, persistent difference.
Exactly. Measurement involves tracking the consistency of functional outputs over time, the statistical distinctiveness of those outputs, and the modularity of its position within the system's architecture.
And importantly, you use moving window statistics.
To filter out transient fluctuations, we want to measure structural trends, not temporary chaos.
Parameter B is degree of integration.
This assesses how effectively the node reinforces the evolving configuration of the system as a whole, moving beyond just local conditions.
So we need to trace its contribution to directional stability.
And its participation in recurring structural patterns, network motifs that bridge different scales.
And for practical application.
The sources suggest causality metrics like transfer entropy, which measures directed information flow, and resilience testing, where we observe the system's response when that node is perturbed.
So a high integration score means the node is vital to the system's overall function, not just its own little corner.
That's right.
Okay, parameter C is the balance factor. This is the crucial non-negotiable safeguard that prevents false coherence.
This parameter measures the necessary proportionality between differentiation and integration. Its purpose is to penalize large deviations in either direction.
So if a node is highly differentiated but unintegrated, it's a parasite.
Exactly. And if it's highly integrated but undifferentiated, it's just redundant. It offers nothing unique.
So the balance factor gives a value from 0 to 1, and it only maximizes when differentiation and integration are equal, or at least proportional.
That's the goal.
So how does the calculation ensure that? If a system has near-perfect integration but 0 differentiation, like your example of an authoritarian regime where all individual identity is erased, wouldn't the balance factor need to drop that overall coherence score to near 0? Walk us through the penalty.
That's exactly its job. It's derived from the ratio of differentiation to integration, applied with a symmetrical scaling function. If differentiation is high and integration is low, the fragmented system, the scaling compresses the overall score heavily.
And conversely, in my example of the authoritarian regime,
Where integration might be near 100% but differentiation approaches 0, the ratio dramatically collapses the balance factor. It ensures that false coherence, resulting from the totalizing structure dominating, yields a very low score. It only rewards proportional capacity.
And finally, parameter D, the tension parameter. This captures the cost and activity of holding contradiction, which we established is the engine of complexity.
It integrates 3 key elements of the node's structural burden. its exposure to conflict, its success at resolving those conflicts, and any residual unresolved tensions.
And we measure conflict events.
Functional degradation, resource contention weighted by their intensity and persistence. Resolution involves events that restore function or create durable integration.
So a good system doesn't avoid conflict. It resolves it constructively. When does the tension parameter rise, indicating a lack of coherence?
It rises when unresolved tensions are numerous relative to the resolved ones, particularly when total conflict exposure is substantial and the unresolved burden remains high. It falls when the node actively transforms that tension into constructive, durable structure.
Makes sense.
The calculation also has to include a small stabilizing constant to ensure that even a lack of conflict, which might suggest unnatural suppression, doesn't artificially lower the burden score.
Okay, now for the final coherence formula aggregate.
The node's structural contribution is the product of those first three. Differentiation times integration times the balance factor.
Right.
System coherence is then the sum of all node contributions, normalized by system size, and critically, it is moderated by that tension parameter.
So it penalizes the system if its overall structural contribution is being generated by nodes that are failing to constructively metabolize their inherent conflicts. So the balance factor and the tension parameter act as joint safeguards against false coherence.
They ensure that high coherence requires proportional capacities and the constructive metabolization of tension, not the suppression of vital tensions or, selective blindness to instability.
The examples are vital here. A mature forest biome versus an ecosystem invasion.
A mature forest biome exhibits high scores because species distinction persists, that's differentiation, nutrient flows reinforce stability, that's integration, and succession tensions are transformed into drivers of renewal, effective tension metabolization.
And when an invasive species enters,
the score drops because unresolved competition increases, proportional balance is lost between the new part and the old whole, and the tension parameter spikes because of all that structural friction.
the framework's adaptability seems wide-ranging, but the parameters themselves would have to change based on the system type.
Oh, absolutely. For living systems, the parameters would involve internal capacities like intention, memory, spiritual intelligence. For non-living systems, they'd reflect structural relations shaped by boundary conditions and external constraints.
They also introduce a supplementary metric, the agency score.
Yes, this is a scalar, from 0 to 1, expressing the proportion of a node's contribution that is internally generated versus externally imposed.
So in a living system, a high agency score would indicate self-driven coherence.
Right. And in a controlled computational system, a high agency score might indicate a useful level of self-organization, but the limits are still externally set.
And finally, the concept of metacoherence looks toward the future viability of the system, not just its present state.
Metacoherence analyzes the trajectory of coherence over time. It adds nonlinear statistical terms, autocorrelation, trend stability, to that foundational measure.
So new parameters like memory fit, adaptive weight.
Trajectory alignment, yes. This temporal lens allows us to detect subtle decay, like, for instance, unusually silent nodes whose tension drops unnaturally.
Which might suggest forced suppression or loss of function rather than genuine resolution.
Exactly. This predictive capability is the ultimate goal, understanding the future structural viability.
This has been an incredibly deep exploration. We moved complexity far beyond simply measuring size or speed.
Far beyond.
We established that the true metrics are qualitative and structural. Relational meaningfulness, the correct integration of tension, and the persistent preservation of multi-layered coherence.
And we identified the necessary architecture. Complexity has to be directional, guided by a structural fidelity that preserves the generative tension between unity and multiplicity. It can't be static.
It has to oscillate between compression and expansion to evolve.
Mm-hmm.
Here's where it gets really interesting for me. We found that true complexity depends on structural fidelity. The system's refusal to resolve contradiction completely, choosing instead to evolve through what the sources call correct incompletion.
That's the heart of it.
The moment a complex system declares mission accomplished, or believes it has achieved finality, it has structurally doomed itself.
This structural logic offers a really powerful filter for analyzing any system. It helps you distinguish genuine, resilient evolution, whether you're looking at a business model, an ecosystem, a social network, or your own personal development,
Right.
from mere quantitative accumulation that is set for inevitable collapse because it lacks that existential coherence.
And that leads to our final provocative thought for you to consider. If complexity is structurally unfinishable, and true systems must continually balance unity and multiplicity through internal contradiction, what tensions are you currently trying to eliminate or suppress in your life or work that might actually be the necessary engine for deeper, meaningful coherence?